adults are philosophers. Serious thinking adults are philosophers, literally. But what's unfortunate in many cases is they don't realize it.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Metamodern Meaning podcast. Today, I'm joined again by Cheryl Armon. Dr. Armon is a seminal thinker in the field of developmental psychology, has done some really fascinating studies about which we spoke last time, and I encourage people to check out our previous conversation where we talked about Dr. Armon's good life model and her longitudinal studies into that. Today, we thought it'd be great to dig a little bit more into all of that because there was aspects of that we weren't able to speak about last time that relate in a very fascinating way with philosophy, philosophical history, and how people make sense of these issues in a significant manner. So there was, more to be said, and this seemed like a great opportunity to dig more into those details. So thanks again, Cheryl, for coming back on the podcast to talk about this.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So again, I encourage people to check out that previous conversation because a lot of the groundwork for the good life and good work and good education models and everything that you're doing with that we discussed. And but yeah, there was an element to all this that we didn't have time to talk about, which is the way. I mean, this is how I'm going to set it up, and then feel free to correct me here. But something to the effect the way that there's a kind of typology of ways that people think about these that in some interesting ways mirrors or matches philosophical schools of thought around the good life, which you'll in a minute kind of break down. And so, the way that your developmental research into this inquiry for people revealed this kind of parallel between how we all think about these sorts of things and how historically these ideas have been theorized by philosophers and other kind of moral theorists, etc., which is a really interesting finding. So anyway, I'll let you explain that better. But yeah, set up the broader framing that you'd like to bring into the mix in this conversation.
Okay, well, I want to make sure to differentiate what we talked about last time and what we're talking about today. So the last time I described the actual empirical research that was collected and shown that the good life over time developed in an invariant sequence. And that if anyone did develop, they went to the next stage in the sequence or stayed the same. Nobody skipped any stages, nobody went backwards, any of that. So I think that's important. But today we're going to discuss the sorts of values that the subjects rely on to explain or justify their responses to questions such as what is the good human life? So the research focused specifically on what is a good human life? Why is that good? How does it work? That sort of thing. And they were interviewed over 17 years, every 4 years. And also, as soon as I got a faculty position, which didn't start at the very beginning, obviously, but in 1984, then my students were collecting data and had similar findings. So we have short-term and long-term studies to be looking at. But I was interested in this particular focus today in what are the values that people actually report are the reasons for their responses. Like, what is it that's so important to them that they would want to go this way as opposed to that way, in terms of deciding what a good human life is. And basically looking at why they think something is good, essentially. And
Yeah, well,
so to my
yeah, I just wanted to underscore that for a second and offer a few thoughts on that. One is just the fact that you did this longitudinal study and that, as you say, you show, I believe, right, no regression, which is really fascinating. Yeah, which for those familiar with other kind of maybe longitudinal developmental studies, that is incredibly impressive. It means that something now, granted, it's a relatively small sample size, so there's a lot more work that could be done here. But
although
yeah,
my students who followed up with it continued for over 17 years.
Hmm.
So they each have, well, not all students, but special students or more advanced students each have published material on this that is completely independent from my own research.
Mm.
Sometimes I'm a secondary author so that they can get published or something, but
Hmm.
really it's their work, it's not my work. And they found, excuse me, the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So that again is really remarkable in terms of kind of the I guess you could say something like the construct validity that's going on here. There seems to be something that's being tapped that has uh, uh, that it seems to be pointing to something real. Then that this is not just sort of a statistically sort of
Right.
invented construct pulled out of thin air, the way that sometimes some of these models can say, "Hey, look, I found something. Let me
Mhm.
measure it." And there's a
Yeah,
lot of
like Jane
sort of those.
Lovinger. Yeah.
Oh, shots fired! Shots fired! Okay, so that I wanted to point that out. The other thing I wanted to say is, that I'm doing some really interesting attempts to I don't want to say my work is really interesting. What I want to say is I'm doing some work right now that I find very interesting, which is looking at the way that what you've tracked can be measured in terms of hierarchical complexification, specifically through the lectical scale, and have also found some really, I think, validating data from that. And then,
What would be fun to do is
hmm,
to take Michael's hierarchical complexity model and apply it to the actual philosophers.
yeah. Well, that actually is
But that
something.
that would have
Yeah.
to be done, in my opinion,
Uh-huh.
that would have to be done prior to actually going out and looking for subjects or whatever. I mean, is it the case
Hmm.
that these philosophers are in fact on various stages of particularly abstract reasoning?
Well, and I'm doing a kind of study actually that will probably get close to that, if not look at that specifically, which is something I'm doing called the Cultural Complexity Index, which is looking at ancient materials and measuring them for hierarchical complexity
Well,
using
that's
again
great.
electrical scale. Yeah, so we could throw in some.
I look
Uh,
forward to seeing that.
Yeah, if you have any suggestions for particular passages, maybe that you feel like would be that would be particularly significant or relevant to this study, that's just the
Well,
kind of
some
comparison I'm
some
looking to
may
do.
come up here.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't want to interrupt you any further. I just wanted to make some of those connections for people who follow this podcast and are interested in developmental theory and have heard things about those other models. I wanted to make some connections to those. So anyway, I'm sorry. As you were, please keep going.
Okay, so my good life work was basically asking people what they thought was good. Like, and it was, in areas, family, work, this and that. And what I found out, besides the fact that people developed in an invariant sequence, was that I was actually initially completely surprised to find that the values of the subjects the values they use to rely to justify their answers, their good life choices. Okay, first off, I'm asking, what is the good life? Why do you think it's good, and so forth. So I was really surprised to find out that the values were far from unique.
Hmm.
I actually expected that, oh, this part of my study is individual differences. It's not going to be, you're not going to follow any model or anything like that. That's what I thought in 1980, 79. But what happened is that the answers I got were far from unique, particularly at the higher stages, say stages 4 and 5, where they were matched almost identically to one of 5 traditional philosophical orientations.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, to me, first off, I just have to say that as an aside, that was a really cool aspect because it really shows my conviction before that all adults are philosophers.
Hmm.
Serious thinking adults are philosophers, literally. But what's unfortunate in many cases is they don't realize it.
Hmm.
And so most people, independent of their level of education, as long as moral philosophy was not their major, because they're really screwed up. But I'm just saying, think philosophy is something different than what they think every day
Hmm.
about what is good, what is right, and so on. They think that's just their ideas of something. And in fact, the opposite is true. When our adults made evaluative decisions, they relied on the same values as particular well known philosophers,
Wow.
a limited number of such philosophers,
Hmm.
over and over and over and over again. So that's what I wanted to talk about today is these different philosophical responses. And I think it would be great if listeners or watchers or whatever these people are um, think about whether these descriptions may fit their thinking,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a really limited number, oddly enough. At least because we're only talking about the Western world, not necessarily just the US, but certainly Western Europe as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and let me again also kind of pause you there and speak back some of the things that I'm hearing. And this is something I wanted to mention earlier. Yeah, your original work talks about evaluative reasoning. So what you're talking about in terms of right now, this justification giving, the reason giving for why something is good is more than just getting at, a particular intuition or something that someone has. It's actually their reason for saying, this is how I see the world, this is what I value, this is what is good, and here's why. It's a justification
And
system.
they know the reasons.
Yeah. And those reasons, it sounds like, map to historically existing ways of making sense of these as well that we get from
The
moral
most
and
famous
philosophers.
ones.
Yeah, yeah. So that's yeah. So go on. That's fascinating.
Okay, so right now we would be looking at the chart.
Yeah, we'll put up the chart so people can get a glimpse
It
of
says the
this.
good at the top, it has hedonism and perfectionism, and it has those all broken down.
Mhm.
So as they are broken down, there end up to be 5 outcomes. So I'm going to describe each one of these.
Great.
Okay. So first you have hedonism, and it's divided between classical and social. So we're going to start with classical hedonism with Epicurus. So for him, the ideal life is a condition free from all pains and anxieties. He sees this as a self sufficient condition, I would say, and not dependent on the outside world for its creation or its maintenance.
Mm.
It has to be all within yourself. He does not, in contrast to popular opinion, Epicurus does not advocate the pursuance of pleasures and all the,
Hmm.
happy day or whatever it is. What he wants is the absence of disturbance rather than the presence of pleasure.
Hmm.
So, when we feel no pain, that we no longer stand in need of pleasure. It's a very interesting idea, not particularly unique at all, as it
Yeah.
turns out.
Well, and also just as a historical note, I find it interesting that Epicurus, a lot of his writings were lost, probably destroyed. If you go back and you look at the period when kind of Christianity comes to dominate the Roman Empire, and a lot of earlier philosophers are kind of cast aside. The That period is kind of what we can point to and say, hey, how do we get our current misconception of Epicureanism as it comes down to us? And it really comes through some Christian apologists of the time who are kind of slandering Epicurus, saying he was just some kind of looking for luxury and kind of gourmand kind of, that kind of the way that
Yeah, which
term
is
tends to be used.
completely wrong.
Yeah, which is not wrong. I mean, it's not right at all. It's actually, he was, as you're saying, talking about saying trying not to experience suffering or pain and look for
But he
ataraxia.
does say that the feelings, our sentiments, are the immediate test of goodness or badness.
Mm,
It's a sense of truth. And the reason it's like that is because he lived in a culture that was completely restrictive. And the only thing that he could do is come up with a philosophy that the individual could do on their own because the society did not support it.
mm,
And so the historical context is really important. After the fall of the Greek civilization, much of philosophy in general had this practical orientation because people were not free. That's simple. But this is an example of a regular subject, regular person with this orientation. What is the good life? I would like to have an enjoyable job that is constant with my interests and would provide for my family. I would like to run a charter boat service. I like the idea of exploring new things without pressure, being free to do things that bring happiness without being tied down 9 to 5. It's a regular working person. I have no desire to live like the Rockefellers, but I do have a desire not to be worried. I'd like to be able to pick up and fly to Mexico for the weekend or something like that. This is the idea then that basically what he talked about is being free of anxiety and worries more than the presence of some particular thing.
mhm.
And regardless of the context of this particular subject, for him, he was completely restricted. So he had to come up with stuff that he could do on his own. And it's important to see that context. He might not have come up with that particular philosophy if the societal demands were different. I think we always have to take that kind of context into account. Ooh. So the subject is choosing a life, not so much of extreme pleasure, but literally the absence
Yeah.
of pressure, anxiety, worry, and stuff like that, which is exactly what Epicurus was talking.
Yeah. And I think connections, I argue, sometimes can be made to actually some Eastern philosophies as well. I mean, if you look at notions in Buddhism, the relationship of a term, I think it's called upekkha, to what Epicurus is talking about as ataraxia, seem very, very similar, or this kind of equanimity that emerges when sort of the disturbances of the body are just sort of quieted and stilled. There's a kind of search for well-being in that mode that's kind of, but people could argue
Yeah,
with that because, yeah.
I thought so, but my husband is really into Buddhism. Okay, he's
Mm,
a Buddhist, and he disagrees with that.
okay, yeah.
But you know, it's open right now. But
Well,
I
and I would
do
say,
think
yeah, I probably because, yeah.
The Western interpretations of yoga and meditation do offer examples of
Mm,
this,
yeah.
which are they advocate kind of Epicurean ends, a peaceful state within oneself, independent of societal challenges and demands. And that's very popular, especially here in LA.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure that it would hold true. Well, he says it wouldn't hold true in the the full idea of Buddhism.
Right. I was going to say, because, it's not just about a kind of bodily sensation of calmness and being at peace. Obviously, there's a deeper kind of metaphysical element that's involved there.
Mhm.
So it's, to call that a form of classical hedonism would, I think, be, yeah, a misnomer. But there are some overlaps in terms of the seeking to eradicate disturbances as a source of kind of finding equanimity. Some overlaps. Anyway, so that's classical
So
hedonism.
I found about 10% of my students, adult subjects, had this orientation,
Hmm.
and they were particularly people who, to put a label on it, were not particularly professionally successful,
Well, and
financially successful.
this also we'll keep coming back to this, but everything that you're talking about right now, this sort of taxonomy of different justifications for the good life, is in a sense a kind of horizontal axis to what vertically you're also looking at, is sort of the developmental angle to this. So each of these perspectives can be expressed at different levels of sort of development, it sounds like, right? So that one could be
Well,
maybe a, yeah.
it's important for me to clarify that the examples I'm using and the examples I used in the formation of my understanding of the philosophy part are all stage 4 or stage 5,
Okay.
because below that stage, most of the experiential import is on face to face.
Hmm.
It's not a societal perspective.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Makes
it's
sense.
very different.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
there are a lot of commonalities, of course, in the values, but
Well, that's an interesting point too, just real quick. Does that it almost suggests that, yeah, if you're going to be thinking about philosophy as such, it would have to be at least stage 4, I guess, too, because otherwise it's sort of more, yeah, interesting. Okay. So everything we're talking about,
yeah,
this
because you
different,
have
yeah,
to have the abstract reasoning.
exactly. Yeah. Gotcha. Okay, good clarification. So all right, well that's uh one element, the classical hedonist.
Social
Yeah.
hedonism is next.
Hmm.
So I use John Stuart Mill as my example. And he argued that human nature is not as generalizable as Epicurus thought. To him, the people do not obtain pleasure merely through sensation, but through the realization of what he called life projects, one's plan of life. And so for him, the pleasures of the intellect, of feeling, imagination, moral sentiments, result in a higher form of happiness than Epicurus did, and that they just have higher faculties. Humans have higher faculties than that. And he thought it sort of animalistic kind of thing. But I have an example of this, a subject example. So, what is the good life is a question. First, it would be a life that has purpose and meaning to generate one's own particular life goals. It would be a sense of functioning at one's fullest. This is a very important feature that so many people talked about, of using one's full capacities and be trusting of one's own values and competencies. So it's very different in terms of the societal context, but in fact, the societal context was totally different. So we don't really know whether Mill would have this view if he hadn't been through the development of society and Bentham, and all the stuff that came before.
Mm.
So it's just important to see it in context. But nevertheless, what's interesting in this case, or what I'm trying to say is what's interesting is that these are everyday people. Not one person I will bring up is a philosopher, but no one else is.
Hmm.
They're just regular people trying to figure out how the hell to live their life, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's just fascinating to me how they just fit into these philosopher types.
Well, can you say a little bit more about what makes it social hedonism? Because just from that example, it sounded still very individual focused, like one's living one's full capacities, one's full potential, all of that. So, yeah, say more about the social hedonism description versus
It's
classical
social
hedonism.
hedonism because Mill argued that it's the great, as you know, it's the greatest good for the greatest number.
Hmm.
So he wants to have this model work for the largest number of people in a society, preferably, obviously, the majority, right? So, on the one hand, you're developing your own capacities. Well, let me go on. So, so I read already it was a life of purpose and meaning, right? To generate one's own particular life goals, be trusting one's own values and competencies. Why would that be good? It would give your life meaning and will be good for others too.
Mm.
It seems to me that a fully functioning person benefits others as well as the self.
Let me ask you a really in the weeds theoretical question here. So, I know, I mean, you studied with, worked with Lawrence Kohlberg, published with Lawrence Kohlberg, and
And
one
John Rawls.
yeah, well, and many others, commons as
Mm,
well. But in Kohlberg, there's this notion of sort of it's a developmental thing that moves people from sort of like into the realm of considering society as well.
mm.
And so I guess my question is like, how do you tease apart reading a classical hedonist view, which is about this sort of, everything you were describing, but it's very individual focused, from a social hedonistic view, which considers the well-being of all society. And how do you tease that apart from a developmental reading? If what is chiefly different there is that one is now considering the good relative to all of society. You see what I mean? Like it'd be easy to
Good
confuse that.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. But okay, so the person who wanted to run the charter boat service,
Hmm.
he's a post-formal operational reasoner.
Hmm.
And the way I know that is because, we gave all those tests.
Yeah.
And he happened to be, a longitudinal subject that I tested 5 times
Hmm.
over 17 years.
Yeah.
And so it's not that he's less intelligent, it's that, well, it's not up to me to explain why he's developed this way, but I would have to say that he's had less power in the culture.
Hmm.
And so, therefore, less opportunity. So, even though his thinking is high IQ wise, his experiences are more limited. And I think that's another whole area that needs to be explored.
Yeah. So other aspects of analyzing or yeah, kind of considering the developmental level of the thought structures involved here shows that this is a post-formal level of thought. Uh, Even though content-wise, it is still focusing a lot on how that person can kind of diminish constraints and pains on themselves rather than framing that within a societal context. So, yeah, that's a really important way to distinguish
So
structure
just
and content.
imagine, I mean, how is that different? I mean, I'm just asking, I really know. Um, when, there are all these, I lived in Latin America for many years. So there's all these groups of people that are really smart, really advanced in their thinking, but are uneducated.
Hmm.
And so they don't have the same, not only language, but conceptual development that other people have because they haven't been exposed to it. But it doesn't mean they're not capable of that development. Far from it.
Hmm. Yeah. So
So,
the life circumstances will be a contingent factor for the kinds of justification systems that develop relative to the good which is independent of kind of developmental capacity. And so I think that's an
Mm,
important point to make. Sorry, I keep interrupting. So yeah, keep going on here
that's
with the social
okay.
hedonism.
Okay, so now we're moving on. So the next category is perfectionism, and we have three types of that. And so the first one is called functionalism. So we know that philosophers writing as early as 305 BC, it's so crazy, offered a detailed description of the good life, such as Aristotle.
Hmm.
So I like him. So for him, the ultimate end of human activity is eudaimonia, but that's often poorly translated as happiness, but I don't think that's appropriate. In modern philosophy, it's more a kind of well-being, a security within oneself.
Hmm.
And it's an active quality that people, according to Aristotle, have to seek over the course of an entire lifetime. It's not something you achieve, it's something you continuously go after. And I think it has to do, for Aristotle, with a fully functioning human. So that means, okay, we're human. What are we capable of? Then fully functioning means that we're able to access and develop all of our capacities. And so that's why I call it functionalism, because it's almost like,
Hmm.
I don't know, I think of it like tools or something, or like a machine, or
Hmm.
it comes about over many, many years. Not something you like study and get it. It's not like that. It's a state. And so here's an example, I think, of this idea. What is the good life? I think that part of what it means to live a good life is the person is fulfilling his or her highest level capacities.
Hmm.
So this is very common, the idea that people know that probably everybody, or at least a good portion of the population, have capacities that are very high up, very complicated, very complex. But they're saying that is the nature of a good life, actually, is to fulfill that. However, you're born, you do
Hmm.
your best. And then I said, what is the place of good work in the good life? Work may be the most important part of the good life. In good work, there are several features. First, I feel that it has to be stimulating and have upward mobility. It should be a learning process, not repetitive. I think what makes work good is when you're using your highest skills and abilities to do it. And this is a very common response.
Hmm.
So then I said, what else makes the work good? I think when you are exercising your highest level abilities, you not only do your best work, but you also have the satisfaction of thinking or knowing the contribution you make will potentially make a difference in society. You feel more like a part of the universe in an abstract sense, that you are here and you're making a contribution.
Now, here's a question. Some of that sounds like it resonates a lot with that social hedonism example from earlier, too, though, because that person said, to live according to your I forget the exact language, but the highest something that they used, and then in relation to society. So these things like seem like maybe sometimes they can even blur into each other, or they're not maybe fully hard and fast categories, but they overlap, maybe.
Yeah, they certainly can, but I think what's different about this functionalism idea is that, I mean, I was giving an example of Aristotle, but in general, this idea, the fullest functioning person as a good in itself
Mm.
is not present in hedonism.
Uh-huh.
You're judging your value by the outcome, not the recognition of the conception. Well, that's the way I see it.
Mm-hmm.
So the second part of the same interviewee is, what is the place of good work in the good life? Work may be the most important part of the good life. In good work, there are several features. First, I feel it has to be stimulating and have upward mobility. It should also be a learning process, non-repetitive. I think what makes the work good is when you are using your best skills and abilities to do it. And this comes around later in a little bit different orientation when people talk about calling, a calling.
Mm.
So it's going toward that, but it doesn't say. So I put it in this perfectionistic functionalist category because of Aristotle's idea of using the highest level capacity. You're fulfilling your end if you're
Yeah.
using your highest level capacity.
Yeah. The use of
Other
the word.
ideas actually add more to that.
Yeah.
You have to not only be doing that, but you have to be doing the other things.
Oh, interesting. Well, I was going to say the word end there. I know. I mean, Aristotle, of course, had this notion of a teleology, right? The telos of things, the end or the goal of things, the all of that was there in the sense that a human being has a different telos than I don't know a cat.
Donkey.
Yeah, a cat, donkey, whatever, because of the different functional capacities, the rational capacities that a human has over and above the animal. And so it seems like that's how I would maybe read that if I'm understanding you right, of something like because of those functional capacities that one understands one's own goals or proper ends as being realized in exercising those faculties. And so when you do
Mhm.
that to the utmost, then you're sort of realizing your telos, and that is a different way of conceiving all of that than say the social hedonist who's
Yeah,
just
I would
like,
agree.
yeah,
I would agree with that.
gotcha.
Um, I found Aristotle's work on friendship particularly interesting.
Hmm.
And since in my good life studies, I asked, what is a good friend? I had an opportunity to use it. And he has three types of friendship. One is based on utility, like how the friends are going to benefit each other. The second is based on pleasure, which is just shared interests and pleasures that you share with other people. But friendships of the good is the highest form of friendship, based on mutual respect, admiration of each other's virtues, and a desire to help each other's grow. It is a friendship where individuals love each other for who they are and never for any personal gain.
Hmm.
And to me, this is so sophisticated. I think we think like that when we're in our good selves, all the time. But he believed that perfect friendship, is the most enduring and valuable because it's founded on virtue and mutual growth. And particularly, he emphasized that good friendship required a commitment to the friend to bring out their best self.
Hmm.
So it's not having the friend that brings out your best self,
Hmm.
it's your commitment to that person brings out their best self if you do it right. So I had an interesting interview on that particular topic. So I asked, we're going to look at an empirical example. What is a good friendship? It primarily involves respect for the differences between the person and yourself, between two people, and the way they live their lives. You're not imposing boundaries on the way they live their lives as long as they're not doing things that are morally wrong. You are responsive to the other person and responsible as far as letting them know, communicating what you think about their ideas and their actions, but you must respect the way they live. It's different from yours. So there's this really interesting idea, of not having to have friends that think just like you, that do just like you, to actually have the wherewithal to have your stuff and then help them to achieve their stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I like that a lot. So I said this same subject, is good friendship based on unconditional love or acceptance? No. I think that friendship should be on based on interaction, not unconditional love, whatever that is. It should be based on the interactions and actions of each other. Respect for the personality of the other does not entail unconditional acceptance of all actions. Pretty cool. Why are friendships important? They are important for people's growth. You must have friendships. Sociality is a basic human need. It is a form of participation in human life, and I don't think we can progress without friendship. It's really interesting to me.
Yeah. And there's and under the, rubric heading of perfectionism, uh all that, there's I'm hearing a lot of language around growth and progression, this sort of a thing of moving towards a goal and all this sort of thing, which
Certainly fulfilling your capacities.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm. So anyway, we're going to move on to Unitarianism with Benedict Spinoza. And so for him, the good life is a life of knowledge. It is through knowledge that happiness can be found, and fundamentally is the knowledge of the union existing between the mind and the whole of nature. That will bring us peace and serenity. That's what he says. To find a good that would so fill the mind that all dependence on contingent circumstances and uncertainty would vanish is Spinoza's aim. He developed a monistic philosophy that identified the one substance, reality, or essence of which all things are expressions. He called it God or nature. Ultimately, however, his philosophy was practical. Its purpose was the guidance of life towards redemption. So, a lot of people are I shouldn't say confused. That means I know and they don't. No, and I don't mean that. A lot of people have different interpretations of Spinoza's point of view. So you just have to take that with a grain of salt. But he does say that the highest forms of knowledge arises joy attended with the idea of God and its cause. That is to say, the love of God, not insofar as we can imagine him as present, but insofar as we understand him to be eternal. And that's what I call the intellectual love of God. So it's not God like a person, but who knows exactly what it is.
Well, this sounds also very Platonic, doesn't it? I mean, would that fall under this category as well? Of course, Plato had the notion, of like ascending into the good, and not just Plato, but also Plotinus, sort of like the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition of sort of the highest good is ascending into the good, which is, conceived of as God essentially, and kind of uniting with that was sort of the highest good. Yeah, would you put that tradition under this heading?
I think so. I mean, my argument is that the love of God in this case is not the love of a divine being at all.
Hmm.
It is a concept that results from understanding, from his point of view, our place in an eternal universe. It's very abstract.
Hmm.
One can never achieve peace and happiness without understanding their place in this universe. The ignorance of one's true nature and purposes causes not only the pains and anxieties, but also accompanies hatred and envy of competition with one's fellows. So he's saying basically, if you don't have that, sort of universal idea, you could be alienated from your fellow people. I think that's probably true. As in the case of Aristotle and Epicurus, Spinoza's central ideas can be found in many modern conceptions of the good life. In particular, the notion that the laws of nature provide the correct understanding of value that underlie modern theories of natural law.
Hmm.
And if you're familiar with those kind of theories, but like Tillich, Martin Luther King, Teilhard de Chardin, Kohlberg. I mean, there's a lot there if you're willing to, if you have the patience to go through to the bottom of.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, I mean, I'm also getting this sense that there's a lot of cross-cutting across these different conceptions as well. I mean, there's the teleology, but there's also, well, anyway, I mean, there are ways in which it's I can see deep down a kind of justificatory difference, but also it seems like there's overlap between a lot of these. Well, and also real quick question. Um, so, growing up, I come from a rather, when I was younger, in a rather more conservative religious context. And if you were to ask people in those spaces, about the good and these sorts of questions, and again, presuming that we're talking about at least a stage 4 here, I do think you'd get something like, well, the good comes from God, and God made all of this way, and so we're supposed to follow that. It's a kind of almost divine command theory of the notion of, like, but not just purely moral. It's like this is all good because God made it and because God is good and this sort of a thing. And I haven't heard any of that or seen any of those kinds of justifications so far, and I don't really expect to in any of this. I'm curious where you would
You're
put
not
that.
hearing it because I'm only telling you, as I mentioned, stage 4 and above,
But you
and
think that
particularly post conventional, stage 5.
but there are theologians, for example, who again are operating at a very high intellectual level capacity, who will
I'm
make
not
similar.
saying there isn't, but I am saying that strangely enough, my 70 subjects and my students, 200 subjects,
Mhm.
did not encounter this at higher stages.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. So it's just not in the data then. I mean, and maybe it's not just a sample thing. It could be that really does just not show up at those levels. But
I
yeah,
don't claim that though, because
yeah,
I don't have evidence for that.
right. Be a be an argument from absence, I suppose. But yeah, okay. Just thought
Kind of
I'd ask that.
interesting. Listen to this response. So we're going to look at this interview data with Spinoza's ideas in mind. What type of work do you consider to be good work? I still look to the idea of vocation as a calling. What happened in work so much in this country, US, has been particularly turning to professional work. This has to be replaced by the notion of a calling or vocation in the old sense, the religious sense of being called into something. But careerism has replaced that. It puts other things first: money, income, success, status, prestige. So is a career something different? Yes. Career interests are those you invest in your own status, standing, or monetary success. To put those first, I think, is a mistake. I think our work has more to do with the notion of what we are called to do. I'm more and more convinced that this work is not necessarily connected to our talents. The work we are cut out to do is often not connected to our talents. Talents, can get in the way of pursuing our best ends. I don't understand exactly what it is, but I think it's the sort of thing that people recognize when it happens to them. But a lot of things get in the way. When you get it right, though, there is a sense that there is something very important about you in this work that you can identify with. And there's a sense of challenge and commitment to it. You know it is to be valued for its own sake and not a means to something else. So I asked, does everyone have a calling? I think so, he says. As part of the human self, my ideal republic would be a society in which that's the way work would be organized and people would be paid to do it, and it would be work of intrinsic worth. So he's a philosopher person.
Mhm.
But I found this very interesting, the idea of a calling.
Well, and it seems to be different, particularly from the kind of fulfillment of the function in the functionalist account, because it's when you mention the talent bit, it's not even necessarily your talents. That would lean more, it sounds like, towards the functional, like, oh, this is what I'm really good at, and then when I do it, I'm operating at the best of my capacity. This says no,
He seems
doesn't.
to be rejecting that.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, not necessarily rejecting it, but not putting it as a primary
yeah.
thing. The primary thing is the calling. If you happen to be good at it too, I'm sure that'd be okay. You
Hmm.
know what I mean?
Hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah,
So
that'd be interesting. Yeah.
this person has, I don't know how much to put into this, but a Catholic background
Hmm.
and was being prepared to go on to the priesthood,
Hmm.
but dropped out at a relatively young age, like his late teens. But he still, seems to be carrying a lot of that.
Yeah.
Not in a bad way, I don't mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean
And he also is a philosophy professor.
the term vocation, of course, as was mentioned, comes from that religious background, and to
Mhm.
be called
Mhm.
also then has a kind of suggestion of there is a caller, which does point to a kind of theological orientation. But I guess one could also have a vocation in some deeper way of feeling called to serve the poor or some kind of. I think of maybe Albert Schweitzer or someone like
That's
that.
what he means.
Yeah, yeah, which can be more abstract, I suppose, than that. Hmm.
But the whole idea of a society where all work would be organized like that is really a complex, idealistic model.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, hard to imagine exactly how that could look.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. So
Okay, so we're going to
yeah,
move on.
okay, and then this brings us to the last major grouping, I think,
Perfectionism,
of yeah, the progressivist perfectionist.
the progressive perfectionist. And so I use John Dewey for this, who I love, because he really got into the idea of work and vocation and what we're supposed to be doing, which I'm very interested in.
Hmm.
So for him, the good life is the active pursuit of new meanings, which result in involvement and improvement of the self and the social environment. It is the expression of effective intelligence, particularly the kind of intelligence that binds us, he said, to other people. And I find this very interesting. He's my favorite
Hmm. Yeah.
because I think what's missing in a lot of the philosophies that I've studied is the notion of connectedness with other people and how that actually works.
Mm.
Anyway, so his idea is that the good life is ongoing perfecting. Like you just work every day. There's no end point. There's no nirvana or whatever. But the society needs to create an environment that liberates people to be able to pursue these ends. And he's quite modern, relatively speaking.
Hmm.
So I'm not going to get into right now how Dewey's philosophy is thought to be a reaction to this and an argument for that and whatever. But I think the main thing that's important here and different is that Dewey rejected Mill's interpretation of man as motivated by the desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. He even said that he thought that was a caricature of human activity, which I found kind of dramatic. He thinks that the whole idea that pleasure is the human's highest good is a big mistake.
Hmm.
Because he gives a lot of examples of looking through history and so on, showing that that's really doesn't seem to be the case. And so I think it's interesting to try to figure out what exactly he thinks it is. But his idea of perfectionism is like an ongoing developmental kind of notion where there is no finite endpoint at all. And it's a good life is a constant active participation in the seeking of challenges, solve just the stuff we do every day, solving our problems, solving hopefully societal problems, and that sort of thing. Okay, so I'll give you an example. What is the good life? In the ideal life, everyone should have an opportunity to participate in life to the fullest. Not all people have equal capacity, but that doesn't mean that any person or any social institution or any social values should limit their development. The ideal life for everyone should be maximizing whatever their potential is. Why is that good? From an abstract, universal point of view, it's the natural part of the natural order of things. For me, the natural order of things is an evolutionary, ongoing growing process. In this evolutionary process, the idea is to maximize the development of life. I mean, we started as one cell, and now we are man, and we can follow the train of thought to the development and maximization of the potential of individual lives. Man cannot select who ought to be given that opportunity. That would lead to arbitrary choices because the process would be human made. And so this is very different and than the others. There's good work involved. I mean, I could go on, but mostly it's this idea of development as the good.
Hmm. Well, and again, though, I hear these resonances with some of the other approaches as well. I mean, the notion there that uh, the justification was because this is the natural way of things sounds also a lot like the Unitarianism, in which the nature or the kind of deep reality is sort of a justification for the good. And again, it's a little hard for me in my mind to tease apart this progressivism from some of the aspects of the functionalism, where you've got a notion of sort of teleology. But maybe what's different there is like that maybe Aristotle, particularly his notion of telos, is very static in some way, and maybe progressivism, the telos can be an unfolding, right? One doesn't just have
I
one
think I
telos.
think that's I think that's accurate
Mm,
because I have a pretty deep understanding of Aristotle's works. I studied a lot in undergrad, and it seemed like he already knew the end and where we're going to go,
mm,
as opposed to this notion, as you're saying, the ongoing progression.
yeah, interesting.
This is sort of interesting. So, this example is what is the good life? In the ideal life, everyone should have the opportunity to participate in life to the fullest. The ideal life, oh, I think I said this right. The ideal life for everyone should be maximizing whatever the potential is. Why is that good? because it's the natural order of things. Natural order is an evolutionary, ongoing, growing process. In this evolutionary process, the idea is to maximize the development of life. Yeah, I read this before, so I guess I'm just repeating myself, but it is this notion of process over product.
Hmm.
That you have to be engaged in this sort of ongoing developmental life.
Yeah, it's helpful because sometimes I talk a lot about teleology, and I think there's a lot of confusion around that term, justifiably, because there's rather different conceptions if one conceives of a pre-given goal that one is simply moving to and developing towards versus development as a successive ongoing series of, in a sense, goals that lead to new goals that lead to new goals.
And literally not knowing me.
Yeah, right. And I think that because there's a lot of shared language around development, progression, movement towards something, it's easy to conflate them, but they're actually rather different visions. And I'm not a teleological thinker in the sense of Aristotle's notion of some particular goal. I'm much more a kind of what would you say, Dewinian?
Julian,
Deweyan.
Julian.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, great. I mean, so that's very helpful. You've done a great job sort of mapping out this breakdown of the major categories, hedonism, perfectionism, and the different sort of subcategories of them. With specific examples. And again, just underscoring the fact that this is how people organically reason about the good and about what they value and why. And that in some really profound sense, people are all engaging in philosophical thought in ways that mirror these deeper patterns in intellectual history and major philosophical thinkers. Is very fascinating kind of conclusion from this. One question that emerges though is how exhaustive do you think this taxonomy is? I'm curious in particular of maybe folks who weren't in this data set, but if you ask someone like a nihilist, right? Hey, what's the good life? And they say, there is no good life. We're all just here. It's utterly meaningless. There's no purpose to anything. Like there are answers like that. Do they fall in any of these categories? Is that a different category, or how many other potential categories might
You
there
know
be?
that I'm very empirically grounded.
Yes, yes, yeah,
So I don't have those data, so I
yeah.
don't know.
Okay. You just say could be, but this is what the data that
I
you have.
think about it, but I
Yeah.
would have to really have the real thing,
Yeah.
not
I'm really
something in my head.
I'm interested to explore that a bit as I've been
You
working.
should.
Yeah, well, in the faith development research that I'm doing at the moment, I hope to have some data around that. A number of these interviews come from folks who have left churches and religions and whatnot. And I'm curious if in that data set, which I haven't dived into yet, is going to reveal any kinds of folks maybe struggling with existential anxiety or nihilism and whatnot, and then trying to make sense of that, maybe in relation to these kinds of frameworks.
I wanted to share this example. So we're talking about what is a good person. A good person must be more than moral. That's a right person. A good person must, in some sense, have basic psychological health. She must have a true sense of herself and be able to have a true sense of others. She must acknowledge the paradoxical parts of herself and others and recognize that it's part of what it means to be human. She must be willing and able to view the world and herself from the eyes of others. Why is that good? Because we are all interdependent with one another. Not only can you not have a self in the absence of society, but you also cannot have essential self knowledge without relations with others. Why is that good? We learn about ourselves through interactions with society and other people. Once one recognizes such interdependence and its value, they have an obligation to enhance its quality. You cannot merely benefit from it. Similarly, once you recognize the unconditional value of others, you have an obligation to support and enhance that value. Now, that's a particular area that I'm particularly interested in. That is, what is our obligation to other people?
And is this one that you just read, would you place that under the progressivist perfectionist category? Yeah.
It goes, yeah, it goes in Dewey's area.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, very fascinating. Well,
And I have multiple examples of this that I won't go into now, but it's sort of surprising that I have more examples of this orientation than any other.
hmm. Which is which orientation that you have more than any other? The progressivist perfectionist approach?
Yeah.
Well, that's not too surprising, is it? You're a developmental psychologist, probably talking to other developmental psychologists. Not to say that that's what
No,
your data set
no,
is, but
no, no. I started collecting this data when I knew nothing.
Hmm.
And I continued it for 27 years, but I changed when I started this study. I was in a BA completion program, unemployed, unmarried, and with a baby.
Hmm.
I was just doing whatever shit I could.
Wow. Well, here's a question. I mean, so on the one hand, you're presenting this as a kind of
And
tact.
also, let me just
Yeah,
say
go ahead.
also,
Sure.
in terms of subject selection, I purposely interviewed very few people I knew
Mm,
at the time.
hmm.
And I put up signs at like UCLA and Cal State and stuff like that, said, "Oh, you can be interviewed, you want to do an interview, you get $15 or whatever it was, and people is random. I mean, it's really pretty random."
Yeah, no, that's important to know. Thank you. Yeah. Well, yeah, what I was going to ask is, we're talking about this taxonomy, which in some ways you're saying is a kind of uh that these are open to any number of developmental, well, I shouldn't say any number, you know, 4 and above in a sense. These are approaches to the good that people can develop through. And so in some senses, as we were talking about at the outset, there's a vertical developmental angle here to this, but then there's this is like this horizontal taxonomy in which through which people can develop as perspectives. But my question is, do you see any of these perspectives that uh maybe, let's say, tend to show up more at higher levels, or that let's say, is there a kind of a developmental aspect to any of these, even though they're horizontally conceived, if that makes sense, right? Is there maybe one way of asking that would be, do you find a lot of fives at the classical hedonist stage, or do you find more progressivist perfectionists that are fives, that sort of a thing? I'm curious about the
I did
correlation.
say that.
Yeah.
Literally, I did say specifically that the perfectionism, progressivism ideas for which I use John Dewey as a model was by far the most prevalent at stage 4 or 5 and above.
Oh, I see. I guess I misunderstood you. Okay, well, that's very fascinating. Yeah, I thought you meant kind of in the whole data set, but also as we were talking about, these don't
Mm-mm.
necessarily show
No,
up.
it wasn't
Yeah.
in the whole data set at all.
Huh.
In fact, it
So
was rarely present at all below stage 4.
right, because there seems, so this is what is a really interesting thing to me, because trying to tease apart, what's just the structural element and what's
Content.
the content. One of the interesting aspects early on as I was discovering developmental theory was it seemed like a way in which we could, in a sense, well, as Kohlberg himself put it, commit the what do you call it? Commit the naturalistic fallacy and get away with it. There's a notion in which, hey, there maybe is this way in which normativity can be developmentally measured, and that as people kind of grow and develop, that there will be a certain tendency to maybe converge towards what we would see as more kind of expansive moral conceptions. But it also then seemed that with time, as structural approaches got kind of more refined, that it wasn't as simple as that, right? You could find very
Right.
highly developed folks talking about things that didn't neatly fit into these higher stages. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'm curious about that relationship, because there's a part of me that assumes, some kind of developmental aspect to this taxonomy as well, and maybe that is that there's something to be read out of the fact the vast majority of what you were finding in these very high stage performances were progressivist in nature and not other. What do you make of that finding?
Number one, I think that Michael Common's work on these higher stages is very interesting and thus far unreplicated and yet to be trusted.
And
I
what
think
what
that's
were
really
his what
important.
was
And
he
I
finding?
hear you referring to it all the time. And I'm thinking, whoa, he's got to be careful. I
Well,
just think
yeah, I'm talking in terms of hierarchical complexity more as a construct, and I work a lot with Theo Dawson's model and the elliptical scale and that sort of a thing. So and there are a lot of findings including using your work and scoring them for hierarchical complexity and scoring them on the elliptical
I'm not
scale.
saying it's
Yeah,
wrong.
yeah.
I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying, in contrast to say Piaget's work or Kohlberg's work, now I wouldn't say my work, but people that have had repetition and repetition and repetition over and over and over, you have to invest a certain amount of belief in those over
Hmm.
these experimental things, including my own.
Mm,
I think we have to be careful. That's all.
sure. Yeah.
I'm
No,
not
definitely.
saying it's not valid.
Yeah. What do you think is the our next steps for this line of research? This is our second conversation. Hopefully there are budding developmental psychologists in the audience and watching or listening to this, and they say, "Hey, this is fascinating. I'd love to continue this." Like what do you say needs to be done or carried forward? How do you keep iterating and replicating this? Like yeah.
I think if I had my druthers, I would really like to work on, and I've had a couple of students doing some of this, a much more refined model,
Mm.
particularly for scoring.
Mhm.
Kohlberg sort of got, in some ways, and the team, and I was actually on some of that team, in the scoring system, sort of got buried in the weeds
Mm.
because you're doing matching, and all this. It's just, to me, I don't know. I worked on the scoring manual and all that, during 1983, and I don't know. I just felt like some of these systems don't go far enough,
Mhm.
and I feel the same way about Michael's work. That he doesn't have, as far as I'm concerned, an adequate scoring system. I don't care what Theo's doing. It's like it doesn't matter to me. I
Well, wait,
see
why don't you
it
care what Theo's doing? I mean, that's like for me the cutting edge stuff right there, which is like I don't know how many of her articles from, well, just how
because it hasn't been replicated.
and what do you mean by replicated?
It has to be before we start jump. I mean, I wish we lived longer, frankly. But I mean, before we start like jumping on the wagon of this or that, it has to be replicated over time, and it takes a long time. And if you're going to do developmental claims, you better be doing it longitudinally.
Well, and Theo's work does have longitudinal data,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
yeah,
she has some. Yeah.
yeah. So,
I'm not putting it down at all.
yeah,
I'm just saying it's newer. We have to experiment. We have to
sure.
do different things. And I wish there was a lot more funding for that kind of work. So I have students who would do it,
Hmm.
but there's very little funding for it.
Well, I'll propose a project that if someone else doesn't do it, I'm going to do it. I believe you're submitting your vast data set to the Murray Research Archive,
I
correct?
did it
Yeah,
already.
and so that
All
is
gone.
Yeah, so that is going to be out there for researchers to use, and I would suggest folks do kind of what I'm currently doing with Fowler data and with other faith development stuff, which is score them all for hierarchical complexity and see what happens. I'm finding some.
I think
Yeah,
that's a cool idea.
yeah.
I'm
I
not
did.
opposed to that at all. I mean, I
Yeah,
think that actually is sort of what I'm talking about,
yeah,
is that, we have all these models out here. We have all these scoring systems out here. Let's try crossbreeding,
yeah.
and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially with the finer grained analysis, I hypothesize that if one were to do this with your data set and do it on the lectical scale with the kind of gradations that exist, you could do some rational reconstruction to get that down to the nitty gritty in terms of not just these whole stages, but, really parsing out at a very fine-tuned level how these ideas are growing on themselves and developing. I think that would be a fascinating study. And
Brendan,
yeah.
do it.
I well, I got a
Do
lot of.
it, baby.
I'm gonna do it. All right, I'll do it. And
I
actually,
mean,
maybe
I
that's
already spent my 39 years doing this.
yeah,
It's your turn.
yeah. Well, how long do you think it takes for those folks over at the Murray database to digitize
I
things?
really don't know. And
Yeah.
I don't know what they're doing. They don't inform me. They don't communicate. I really don't know.
Gotcha. All right. Well, it's on my list, so we'll see about that. This was absolutely delightful. Hopefully, you feel like you got to get into all the stuff that we didn't get into last time. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring in at this point before we start to close up around your work, around this model that you feel like you'd like to mention?
Well, I do think that there's too little research going into this idea of valuing, what I call the good, but people talk value, it doesn't matter. I think we still have a relatively poor understanding of how values, that is, preferences, develop.
Hmm.
And I mean, I'm fortunate in that I have some longitudinal data, with people who started at age 4 or stuff like that. But then, it's a very small sample, and it's inadequate, completely inadequate. And it's just sad for me that they're really in modern times, not the investment in this kind of longitudinal work.
Yeah.
So anything that could make that happen would be good.
Yeah. Well, I second that. And as I've said in other contexts too, I also maybe this is optimistic or I don't know, confirmation bias or uh there's a term I'm looking for, it's not coming to me, but maybe I'm reading too much into it. But I think that things are changing, and I do think that there's starting to be a little bit of a paradigm shift around this stuff, and I hope that that brings with it a return of investment in every sense into this kind of research, because what's more important than value? you know what's more valuable?
Don't ask
um
me. I
yeah,
don't think anything
yeah.
is.
Thank you so much for this. This was really delightful. Until another conversation potentially. Thank you so much.
Well, thank
Appreciate it.
you.